So, Moldova, a tiny country caught in a tug of war between Europe's West and Putin's Russia, is about to hold an election that could prove pivotal. On paper, it's merely a parliamentary vote involving a nation of just 2.6 million people. But in reality, this could decide whether Europe, as a collective, still has the power to defend democracy on its borders, or whether Putin's Russia can capture a country without firing a shot. Indeed, this election is so much bigger than you can imagine. It isn't just about Moldova's future in itself, it's about Ukraine's survival, Europe's security and identity, and Putin's ability to rewrite the rules of engagement and geopolitics. So in this video, I wanted to break down how Moscow has been trying to hack Moldova's democracy, why the EU is so heavily invested but yet still worryingly hasn't done enough, and what this tells us about Putin's wider hybrid strategies to undermine democratic rights and values.
This is The Global Gambit.
How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to the channel, where we are returning to the European theatre, but one specific area, and one that I consider to be grossly overlooked, despite considering how disproportionately it impacts geopolitical events, despite its size. Now, this Sunday, Moldova has a critical election, and one that, well, you could argue looks like any other. Campaign rallies, speeches, promises of better jobs and cheaper energy. But peel back that curtain and of course you'll see what's more at stake. Moldova's chance of joining the European Union by 2028. Before diving in further though, what do you think about this? Can Europe do more to defend smaller countries caught in this greater geopolitical tug of war? Or is this something where it's more words than action? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, because there is a unique way that I can cover this. Having been a mixture of English and Russian, it gives me an insider's view of how the Kremlin likes to think and the perspective it can place in the Western geopolitical framework. You see my earlier breakdowns on Romania, Moldova's previous elections as well, and I'd like to try to make sense of Putin's expansionist rhetoric and actions, including in the Baltics in the past couple of weeks. And this is the story in Moldova right now. Nicu Popescu, the country's former foreign minister, has told voters again and again, this time your ballot really matters. You see, because without a parliamentary majority for his pro-European party, Moldova's accession talks could, well, grind to an effective halt. And if that happens, then Putin wins, because the EU loses another piece of its potential buffer frontier. And that's exactly why the Kremlin has been pouring more money into fixing Moldova's elections this year than in the past 30 years combined. So, to break this down, how has Russia been doing this? Not through tanks at the border, at least not yet, but through what Moscow calls active measures. That means infiltrating Moldova's information space. Not airspace like in Estonia, but its cybernetics area. During the 2024 presidential elections, 1 in 3 sources cover the vote was compromised. 150 Kremlin-linked Telegram channels pushed disinformation in real time. And of course, this isn't random chaos. Bloomberg has revealed internal Kremlin blueprints, finalized in the spring, laying out what's known as a multi-pronged strategy coordinated directly from Putin's executive office. So the plan was this. Number 1, recruit Moldovians abroad, playing into that diaspora effect, including in Russia, to flood polling stations across the EU, pay for others to stage disruptive protests, run disinformation campaigns across TikTok, Facebook, Telegram, and even actual call centers, use compromising material to pressure Moldovan officials into disrupting the electoral process. The goal obviously being clear: weaken Maia Sandu's pro-EU party, strip it of its majority, and ultimately drive her from power long term. Moldovan police have been scrambling to respond, just days ago raiding more than 250 locations across the country, including 4 prisons, targeting over 100 people in an alleged Russian black-backed plot for mass unrest. They've detained 74 suspects, dismantled cash laundering operations, and seized millions of lei, evidence of Moscow's money trail. Authorities say the plan was to spark violent protests if Sandu's party loses, or to discredit the result if she wins. Either way, Russia undermines it and creates domestic chaos. And remember, the Kremlin doesn't need its proxies to win outright. It only needs them in parliament to stall Moldova's EU path and corrode trust in the system long enough for Putin to seep his claws into it. But one of the biggest problems with global news is that it's not just about what happened, it's about how it's framed, the narrative. Two outlets can cover the same event and leave you with completely different impressions. And if you're only reading from one perspective, then, well, you miss half the story. Take Ukraine right now. President Zelensky has reiterated again that the current front lines should be the baseline for any future negotiations with Russia. And depending upon where you look, that single statement gets spun in completely different directions. On the one hand, in Western outlets, you'll see headlines framing it as Ukraine holding firm. However, on the other hand, from Russian state media, it's cast as a desperate concession. And even some European coverage presents it as a pragmatic step to keep talks alive. Same words, three very different realities. Now, that's exactly the kind of bias and framing you miss if you only stick to one news bubble. So that's why I use today's sponsor, Ground News. It pulls in thousands of outlets into one place, lets you compare headlines side by side, track political bias, and even my favourite feature, the blind spot, covering stories that the left, right, or international press aren't covering at all. It's a game changer if you want to cut through the spin and see the bigger picture, which if you're a regular here will know mirrors my own mission on this channel, to engage with perspectives across the spectrum, rather than being trapped in a single unidimensional narrative. You can check it out at ground.news/Pyotr, and with my link, you'll get 40% off unlimited access. I'll leave the link in the description and pinned comment, so you can really check it out for yourself. Now, undercover journalists and others on the ground in Chisinau were told that the strategy boils down to just two words: money and fear, testaments the old of time. The money is vast. Sandu herself told European lawmakers that Russia had spent about 150 million euros. That's nearly 1% of Moldova's entire GDP to sway last year's EU referendum and presidential vote. European officials say that the Kremlin has almost certainly committed similar amounts to this month's election, if not more. Police recently intercepted 5 million lei, about $300,000, in a single operation. The fear comes from disinformation. Troll farms flood feeds with claims that PAS will force EU-mandated LGBTQ propaganda in schools or drag Moldova into the Russo-Ukrainian war. The message is slick, produced in both Romanian and Russian for maximum reach and effect, often amplified also through sports clubs, criminal networks, or the diaspora groups. And the scale is truly staggering when you get to the numbers. TikTok says it took down 450 or so compromised Moldovan accounts last month, but for every account removed, of course, more appear. One Russian document even outlined plans to recruit young men from sports clubs to stage violent provocations during and after voting. Demonstrations calling for Sandu to resign or simply painting the entire result as illegitimate. This is hybrid warfare in its purest form, at its highest level that we've arguably ever seen. Russia is capturing Moldova through the ballot box, not the battlefield, and increasingly shameless in how it does so. Now, to understand why Moldova is so contested, you obviously have to understand the history. For centuries, Moldova has been caught between empires. It was part of the Ottoman Empire sphere, then under the Russian imperial rule, and later absorbed into the broader Soviet Union. Generations grew up speaking Russian, studying in Moscow, and depending on Soviet history. To this day, hundreds of thousands of Moldovians work in Russia, send remittances back home, and consume Russian language media. So that legacy matters. Polls show most Moldovans want to join the EU, but a significant minority feel nostalgia for the old times, not just because of the propaganda, but because of family, livelihoods, and their memories being bound with former Russian, colonialist reasons. For older Moldovians, the USSR wasn't only repression and corruption, it was also stability, cheaper energy, and familiar cultural connections. Therefore, this is what makes the country so vulnerable. The Kremlin doesn't have to invent loyalties out of thin air, it only has to amplify them, play on shared history, and promise that Moscow can once again provide the things that Europe seems too slow or unwilling to provide. So while Brussels talks about the language of reforms, accession chapters, and 170,000 pages of law, Putin and the Kremlin speak much more to the language of memory, identity, and emotion. And for many voters, that is far more persuasive and influential. With all that in mind, then, why does this matter for Europe? Well, because you could argue Moldova is the test case for whether the EU can act geopolitically and specifically geostrategically independent of the broader United States. If it can be one of the poles in this changing balance of power. If Moldova succeeds in joining the EU, it would show that enlargement isn't just a gift to be earned, but Europe's most powerful foreign policy tool as well. Brussels has already invested hundreds of millions of euros in Moldova of its own, repairing schools, paying for energy, fixing sewage systems. But if pro-Russian parties stall or derail Moldova's path, it's not just about one small country. It leaves Ukraine further isolated, nearly surrounded by hostile states. It hands Moscow a cheap win, showing the world that it can reshape borders and politics without lifting a finger or firing a shot. And let's be blunt, if the EU can't hold the line with Moldova, how can it possibly hope to succeed in Ukraine or the broader Baltics? Of course, the Moldovan government hasn't been perfect either. The ruling party promised to clean up corruption and fix the justice system. Instead, many Moldovians have seen only rising prices, stagnant wages, and heavy-handed raids on opposition offices that look a little too much like old authoritarian habits. So beyond Moldova, well, of course, Moscow's playbook doesn't end here. Already, Russia has been weaponizing Moldova's breakaway regions like Transnistria or Gagauza, turning local grievances into geopolitical leverage and creating a systemic structural imbalance within the country. Of course, the Kremlin is testing methods here that it can export elsewhere, particularly to, say, Hungary, where Viktor Orban plays Moscow's game inside the EU, or Slovakia's Robert Fico, who has flirted with it as well. The Kremlin doesn't need a military victory in Ukraine if it can paralyze Europe politically from within, and certainly doesn't have the capacity to do anything militarily, given how badly it's going for it in Ukraine. So think about it. Moldova and Ukraine were invited to begin EU extension together. One is fighting a brutal, barbaric war, the other a hybrid one. So, is this a pivotal moment for Moldova? Certainly. Is it too late? Maybe not. But the descent into potential authoritarian capture is always gradual, but then very sudden. As Maya Sandu has warned European lawmakers, the Kremlin's goal is clear: to capture Moldova through the ballot box, to use us against Ukraine, and to turn us into a launchpad for further hybrid attacks across the European Union. Therefore, Europeans' choice is simple: treat Moldova as another expendable frontier, or as the frontline of a much bigger war, something much more serious, and one that decides whether Russia can still dictate the fate of its neighbours, and whether the EU is actually treated as a genuine, not just soft power entity, but also geopolitical force. Because make no mistake, what's happening in Moldova is not a drill, not a hoax. It's the future of democracy under siege. Thanks for watching. Let me know what you think about this topic in the comments below. I am very curious about it because I don't think it's going to receive much coverage, despite the much larger implications it can have. And if you found these sorts of takes interesting, then consider subscribing as well, where we'll see reviews and debriefs on events like these. As I said at the beginning, I am Pyotr Kurzin. I am a mixture of English and Russian, which means I try to bring this rather unique dynamic to the channel to give a more comprehensive alternative perspective about how, say, Russia plays into Western values, including for my education at Johns Hopkins SAIS in the US, but also the people that I interact with, be them professionals like diplomats and economists to activists, content creators, and more. And I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and watch this video next on what the real reason is Putin's provocations in NATO.